The night before my law school interview, my brother smiled while blue paint spread across the only suit I owned. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared as the thick paint dripped from the sleeve onto the hardwood floor. Ryan looked at me, shrugged, and laughed. "Guess you're not wearing that tomorrow." My mother glanced up from the kitchen table, sighed dramatically, and went back to scrolling on her phone. "Oh, Favour, stop overreacting. It was obviously an accident." An accident. Ryan was still holding the open paint can. He hadn't even tried to hide the grin on his face. My father folded his newspaper without looking at the suit. "If you're smart enough for law school, you're smart enough to solve a little problem." I looked from one face to another. Not one of them offered to help. Not one of them apologized. The interview I'd spent 4 years working toward was less than 12 hours away. That navy suit wasn't expensive. It wasn't designer. I'd bought it secondhand after saving tips from working evening shifts at a grocery store. Every dollar had mattered. Every stitch represented another hour I'd spent stocking shelves while classmates slept. I carried the jacket into the laundry room and spent the next 3 hours trying everything. Cold water, dish soap, vinegar, baking soda, internet tricks. Nothing worked. The bright blue stain faded into a cloudy smear that somehow looked even worse. By 2 in the morning, my hands were raw. The jacket was still ruined. For one terrifying moment, I almost emailed admissions to cancel. Maybe I could ask for another interview date. Maybe they'd understand. But another thought immediately followed. People like me didn't get second chances. Not because admissions officers were unfair. Because life rarely gave them. I had earned that interview after graduating at the top of my class, studying while working nearly 30 hours every week, and surviving 4 years in a house where every achievement somehow became an inconvenience to someone else. I wasn't giving it away. Even if I had to walk into that building wearing a stained jacket. The next morning, I left before sunrise. No one wished me luck. No one asked how I felt. Ryan was asleep. Or pretending to be. As I reached the front door, my father called from the living room. "If they reject you, don't come blaming us." My mother added without looking up. "Maybe next time don't buy such cheap clothes." I closed the door quietly. The bus ride downtown felt longer than usual. Every time someone glanced toward the blue stain on my sleeve, I pulled my folder closer against my chest. I kept imagining what the admissions committee would think. Sloppy. Unprepared. Unprofessional. Maybe they'd assume I didn't care. They'd never know I'd spent years sacrificing meals to afford textbooks. They'd never know I'd skipped birthday parties because overtime paid better. All they'd see was the jacket. When I arrived at Blackwood School of Law, students filled the lobby. Perfect suits. Polished shoes. Leather briefcases. Parents hugged their sons and daughters. Fathers adjusted ties. Mothers brushed invisible lint from jackets. I stood alone. One girl smiled politely before her eyes drifted toward the faded blue stain. Her smile disappeared. I suddenly wished the floor would open beneath me. A receptionist called my name. "Favour Carter." I stood. My legs felt strangely heavy. Every step toward the admissions office echoed louder than the last. The receptionist opened a large oak door. "Mr. Nathaniel Brooks will see you now." I stepped inside. The admissions director rose from behind his desk with a professional smile. "Good morning, Ms. Carter." Then his eyes dropped to my stained jacket. The smile faded. For one painful second, I thought it was over. He'd already judged me. He slowly looked back at my face. Then he picked up my application folder. His eyes stopped on my last name. "Carter." His expression changed again. Not disappointment. Recognition. He looked at me much more carefully now. Then he asked a question that made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. Your father. He paused. Is Harold Carter? I nodded cautiously. Yes. He remained completely still. Then, without saying another word, he quietly walked across the room, closed the office door, and locked it. The soft click of the lock echoed through the office. For a split second, my stomach tightened. Had I done something wrong? Mr. Nathaniel Brooks noticed my expression immediately. I'm sorry, he said, raising both hands slightly. I didn't mean to alarm you. I lock the door whenever we're discussing confidential matters. Confidential. That wasn't the word I expected to hear. He gestured toward the chair. Please have a seat. I sat carefully, still clutching the folder that held every transcript, recommendation letter, and personal statement I'd spent months perfecting. For several seconds, he didn't speak. Instead, he looked at my application, then at me, then back to my application again. Finally, he asked quietly, Before we begin, may I ask you something personal? I hesitated. I suppose. When was the last time you spoke to your grandfather, Thomas Carter? The question hit me like cold water. My grandfather passed away 6 years ago. I know. His answer came almost too quickly. I mean, before he passed. I swallowed. About 2 weeks before he died. Mr. Brooks nodded slowly. And after his passing, did you ever meet with his attorney? No. Attend a reading of his estate? I frowned. There wasn't one. Who told you that? My parents. What exactly did they say? I replayed the conversation in my mind. They said Grandpa left everything to charity. I forced a small laugh. They told me he believed people should earn their own future. Mr. Brooks didn't smile. Instead, something about his face seemed to harden. Almost like he was trying not to react. I see. He closed the folder gently. Ms. Carter. He paused. Let me make something very clear. This interview will be evaluated on your qualifications, not your clothing. I felt heat rise to my face. I'm sorry about the suit. You don't owe me an apology. His eyes drifted toward the faded blue stain. If anything, he stopped himself. Never mind. There it was again. Another unfinished sentence. Another hint that he knew something I didn't. He leaned forward. Would you tell me how this happened? For a moment, I considered lying. Saying I spilled coffee. Dropped paint while moving furniture. Anything but the truth. Instead, I heard myself say, my brother poured paint on it. Mr. Brooks remained silent. My parents called it an accident. Silence. They said I was overreacting. Still silence. They refused to help replace it. Only then did he ask, was it actually an accident? I met his eyes. No. He nodded once, as though the answer confirmed something. Not surprised. Confirmed. He didn't ask another question about my family. Instead, he smiled professionally. Let's begin. For the next hour, everything else disappeared. Constitutional law. Ethics. Public policy. Case analysis. Why I wanted to become an attorney. Why public interest litigation mattered to me. How I handled pressure. Ironically, the pressure I'd experienced less than 12 hours earlier made every interview question feel easier. When he presented a difficult legal scenario involving inheritance disputes, I answered carefully, explaining why transparency mattered more than convenience. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he wrote something unusually long in his notes. Near the end, he closed his notebook. I've interviewed applicants for 23 years. I waited. I've met students with perfect grades. Another pause. I've met students with perfect resumes. He looked directly at me. But resilience can't be manufactured. For the first time all morning, I felt myself breathe normally. Maybe, just maybe, I'd done enough. The interview officially ended. I stood. So, I said with a nervous smile, does this mean I survived? He smiled back. I believe you did exceptionally well. Relief washed over me, until he opened one of his desk drawers. Instead of another admissions document, he removed an old business card. The edges were slightly yellow from age. He wrote something on the back before sliding it across the desk. I'd like you to visit this attorney. I looked down. Margaret Ellis. Ellis and Rowan Estate Law. I don't understand. You don't have to. His voice remained calm. Not yet. I turned the card over. What am I supposed to tell her? He looked out the window for several seconds before answering. Tell her Nathaniel Brooks remembers the Carter estate. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Carter estate. He nodded once. I can't discuss matters that were entrusted to me decades ago. My heartbeat quickened. But I can tell you this. He folded his hands together. If everything you've told me today is accurate, someone owes you answers. I stared at him. About what? He gave the smallest shake of his head. I hope I'm wrong. That wasn't the answer I'd expected. I truly do. He stood and extended his hand. Good luck, Miss Carter. The interview was over. But somehow, it felt like something much bigger had just begun. An hour later, I stepped back into my parents' house. Ryan was sitting on the couch playing video games. The moment he saw the stained jacket, he burst into laughter. So, he smirked. They throw you out the minute they saw that suit. Ryan's laugh filled the living room. So, he said, tossing his game controller onto the couch, did they throw you out the second they saw that jacket? Before I could answer, my mother walked in carrying a basket of laundry. I told you, she said. Presentation matters. You should have listened and gotten a better suit. I stared at her. You refused to help me buy one. She shrugged. We're not responsible for every little problem you have. My father lowered his reading glasses just enough to look at me. Well, his voice carried more curiosity than concern. Did you embarrass yourself? For the first time in years, I didn't rush to defend myself. I had my interview. And it went well. Ryan snorted. Sure it did. He stood, walked past me, and deliberately brushed against the stained sleeve. Maybe they'll admit you out of pity. My mother laughed quietly. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just enough for me to hear. It hurt more than shouting ever had. Without another word, I walked upstairs. As soon as my bedroom door closed, I reached into my folder and pulled out the business card. Margaret Ellis. Ellis and Rowan Estate Law. On the back, written neatly in blue ink, Nathaniel Brooks remembers the Carter estate. I read those words at least 20 times. The Carter estate. Not Grandpa's estate. Not Thomas Carter's estate. The Carter estate. Why phrase it that way? What did it mean? I opened my laptop and searched for Margaret Ellis. She specialized almost exclusively in probate litigation and estate disputes. She'd spent more than 30 years handling inheritance cases. That made even less sense. My grandfather had died 6 years earlier. If there had been an estate issue, why had no one ever contacted me? Unless... No. I pushed the thought away. My parents had lied before. About little things. Money. Promises. Ryan. But something this big. That seemed impossible. Didn't it? The following morning, I called the number. The receptionist answered professionally. Ellis and Rowan. My name is Favour Carter. Silence. I was told to speak with Margaret Ellis. Do you have an appointment? No. What is this regarding? I hesitated. Nathaniel Brooks asked me to come. The tone changed immediately. One moment, please. A minute later, another voice came on the line. Older. Calm. This is Margaret Ellis. Mr. Brooks asked me to contact you. Another pause. Then she asked only one question. Are you Thomas Carter's granddaughter? Yes. I'd like to see you this afternoon. Ellis and Rowan occupied the third floor of a brick building that looked older than almost everything around it. Nothing about the office suggested luxury. Just shelves filled with legal volumes and framed certificates collected over decades. Margaret Ellis greeted me herself. She appeared to be in her late 60s, dressed simply, with silver hair pulled neatly behind her head. She shook my hand warmly. You look exactly like your grandfather. I'd heard people say I resembled him before. But hearing it from someone outside, the family felt different. She motioned toward her office. I understand Nathaniel sent you. Yes. He rarely asks people to see me. She folded her hands. So tell me, what do you know about your grandfather's estate? Almost nothing. What were you told? I repeated the story I'd believed for 6 years. He left everything to charity. He believed family members should build their own futures. He didn't want anyone relying on inheritance. Margaret didn't interrupt. When I finished, she slowly removed her glasses. I was afraid you'd say that. My pulse quickened. What does that mean? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she unlocked a tall filing cabinet behind her desk. One drawer, then another. Finally, she pulled out a thick gray archive box. Dust coated the lid. Across the front, in faded handwriting, were 4 words. Thomas Carter Estate File. She placed it carefully on her desk. Then she looked directly at me. I haven't opened this box in nearly 6 years. Margaret Ellis rested both hands on the archive box. For several moments, neither of us spoke. It wasn't suspense for the sake of drama. It felt more like respect. Respect for a man who was no longer alive. Respect for documents that had quietly waited years for the person they were meant to protect. She lifted the lid. Inside were neatly organized folders, each labeled by date. Letters, probate filings, certified mail receipts, bank correspondence, legal notes. Nothing looked rushed. Nothing looked accidental. This, Margaret said softly, was one of the most carefully planned estates I ever worked on. I frowned. My grandfather wasn't wealthy. He wasn't extraordinarily wealthy, she agreed, but he spent decades building what he had. More importantly, he was intentional. She opened the first folder. Thomas Carter came to me 3 years before his death. She slid a yellow legal pad across the desk. The handwriting was instantly familiar. I'd seen birthday cards written in that same careful script. One of his greatest concerns, she continued, was making sure your education would never depend on anyone else's approval. My throat tightened. He said that. Margaret nodded. He spoke about you often. She looked down at the notes. He believed you would become a lawyer someday. I couldn't answer, because suddenly I was remembering things I'd buried years ago. Grandpa asking me what I wanted to be when I grew up. Buying me a children's book about famous Supreme Court cases. Telling everyone at family dinners that I argued like a future attorney. At the time, everyone laughed, including my parents. I'd assumed they were laughing with him. Now I wasn't so sure. Margaret carefully opened another folder. This is where things became unusual. She placed several certified mail receipts on the desk. After Thomas passed away, our office mailed formal notices. I leaned forward. To who? Your parents. She pointed to the signatures. Both were unmistakable. Harold Carter. Diane Carter. My stomach dropped. They received these. Yes. They signed for every one. My heartbeat quickened. But they told me. I know what they told you. She spoke gently. They told you there was no reason for you to meet with me. I nodded silently. Margaret sighed. They also canceled 3 scheduled appointments. What appointments? Meetings concerning the administration of the estate. I stared at her. They said I wasn't needed. They specifically requested that all communication go through them. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Could they do that? Not indefinitely. She paused. But at the time, you were still financially dependent on them. I looked back at the signed receipts. Every lie I'd believed suddenly had dates attached to it. Addresses. Signatures. Proof. Margaret reached for another folder but stopped. I need to explain something carefully. She folded her hands. I cannot simply hand over confidential estate documents because someone asks. I understand. I have ethical obligations. She held my gaze. But I can verify whether certain statements are true. I nodded. Were you intentionally excluded from your grandfather's estate? She answered immediately. No. The word echoed in my head. No. Not maybe. Not probably. No. Were you mentioned by name? Yes. Multiple times. I struggled to breathe evenly. Did my grandfather want me to attend law school? Margaret smiled sadly. He expected it. Tears blurred my vision before I even realized I was crying. For 6 years, I'd believed I hadn't been good enough. That somehow Grandpa had looked at me and decided I deserved nothing. All because the people I trusted most had said so. Margaret handed me a tissue. I'm sorry. For what? For realizing this alone. She stood and walked toward a framed photograph hanging on the wall. It showed a much younger Margaret standing beside my grandfather after what looked like the signing of important documents. He was proud of you. She said it so simply, as though it were the easiest fact in the world. He talked about your determination constantly. I wiped my eyes. So, what happens now? Margaret returned to her desk. Now we verify everything formally. She reached for the telephone. I'll need authorization from the probate court to release certain records. How long will that take? Not long. She hesitated. There's one more thing. My heart sank again. The educational trust your grandfather created. She looked directly into my eyes. It was never closed. I frowned. I don't understand. It shouldn't still exist. Unless... She opened one final ledger. Its intended purpose was never fulfilled. The realization hit both of us at the same time. If the trust had never been properly distributed, then somewhere, the money my grandfather intended for my future had never reached me. I couldn't stop staring at the ledger. The educational trust. Still open. 6 years after my grandfather's death. Is that even possible? I asked. Margaret nodded slowly. It's unusual, but not impossible. She turned the ledger toward me. Trusts don't simply disappear. They are either distributed according to the grantor's instructions or they remain under administration until legal requirements are satisfied. My pulse quickened. So if it wasn't distributed? Something interrupted the process. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another folder marked with a bright red tab. I don't like making assumptions. Let's stick to facts. She laid several documents side by side. The trust was established. She pointed to the first page. Funding was verified. Another page. The beneficiary was identified. Another page. And the purpose was clearly defined. I looked down. Even with most of the legal language, one sentence stood out. Primary beneficiary, Favour Carter. My full name. Typed in black ink. No room for misunderstanding. No room for excuses. For years, I'd believed I was never included. Instead, I had been the very first person listed. My hands trembled. Margaret noticed. You don't have to read everything today. I do. My voice came out stronger than I expected. I've spent 6 years believing a lie. I want to know all of it. She gave a small nod. Fair enough. Another document appeared. This one outlined the trust's purpose. Educational expenses. Books. Housing. Bar examination costs. Even professional licensing fees after graduation. I laughed once. A broken, disbelieving laugh. My student loans. I whispered. I didn't have to take them. Margaret's expression softened. It appears your grandfather hoped you never would. The weight of that sentence settled heavily over the room. Every overnight shift. Every skipped meal. Every semester wondering whether I could afford tuition. Every panic attack over rent. Every one of those struggles replayed through my mind. Not because help didn't exist. Because someone had hidden it. I closed my eyes. Not out of anger. Out of exhaustion. Years of unnecessary exhaustion. Margaret finally broke the silence. There is something else. I looked up. The trust documents contain annual reporting requirements. What does that mean? The trustee was expected to provide updates. Who was the trustee? She checked another page. For the first 6 months. Our firm. And after that. She hesitated. The role transferred. To who? She slowly turned the document toward me. Harold Carter. My father. I felt every muscle in my body tense. My father controlled the trust. For a limited administrative period. And then, he was expected to distribute the assets according to the trust instructions. Did he? I can't answer that without complete financial records. The careful wording told me everything. She couldn't prove it yet, but she already suspected the answer. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was leaving work. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Hello? Ms. Carter? Yes. This is Blackwood School of Law. My heart nearly stopped. We're pleased to inform you that you've been offered admission. For a moment, I couldn't speak. After everything that had happened. After the ruined suit. After the uncertainty. I'd actually made it. The admissions counselor continued. You'll receive scholarship information by email later today. Scholarship. Another burden lifted. I thanked her repeatedly before ending the call. I stood outside the grocery store, smiling through tears. I wanted to call someone. Anyone. To share the news. Then reality settled in. The people who should have celebrated most had spent years trying to make sure this moment never happened. When I walked into the house that evening, Ryan was sitting at the kitchen island. He looked up. So, I smiled. I got in. He blinked. What? I was admitted. For the first time in my life. Ryan had absolutely nothing to say. Then my mother walked in. What are you talking about? I was accepted into Blackwood. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh. Well. That's nice. Nice. 4 years of sacrifice. Thousands of hours of work. One of the best law schools in the state. And all she could manage was nice. My father came home a few minutes later. My mother immediately told him. He looked at me for several long seconds. Then he smiled. But something about it felt wrong. Too quick. Too rehearsed. Almost calculating. He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm proud of you. The words should have made me happy. Instead, they made me uneasy. Because it was the first time he'd ever said them. And somehow, it felt less like congratulations and more like damage control. My father's hand stayed on my shoulder just a second too long. I'm proud of you, he repeated. The words sounded correct, but they didn't feel true. Not after years of hearing that law school was unrealistic. Not after refusing to replace the suit Ryan had ruined. Not after telling me that morning, if they reject you, don't come blaming us. I stepped back. Thanks. It was all I could manage. For the first time, I watched my parents instead of listening to them. My father glanced at my mother. Just for an instant. She gave the slightest nod. It was the kind of silent communication people develop after decades together. A conversation without words. I'd seen it all my life. I had simply never paid attention. The next morning, Margaret Ellis called. I've received authorization to obtain the remaining probate records. Already. The court keeps excellent archives. She paused. And Favour. Yes. I think you'd better come in. Her tone wasn't frightened. It was serious. Very serious. An hour later, I was back in her office. This time, the gray archive box wasn't on her desk. Instead, several thick binders were spread across the conference table. Margaret stood beside them. So much, I asked. She gave a small smile. Paper trails usually tell the truth. I sat down. She opened the first binder. These are bank disbursement records. The second. These are trustee reports. The third. Property transfers. Then she looked directly at me. They all point to the same question. What question? She slid one document toward me. Why was your educational trust never used for your education? I read the page. There were deposits, investment statements, interest earnings. Everything appeared normal. Until I noticed one line. Trust administration transfer, approved asterisk. Successor trustee, Harold Carter. Date. Signature. Court stamp. So my father really did control it. Yes. For a period of time. And after that, Margaret slowly produced another sheet. I've spent all morning looking for evidence that he completed his duties. She shook her head. I haven't found it. Instead, she pointed to a series of withdrawals. Large withdrawals. Years apart. Always just below reporting thresholds that would automatically trigger additional review. What are those? I don't know. Yet, the money hadn't vanished overnight. It had disappeared gradually. Quietly. Small enough to avoid attention. Large enough to matter. My grandfather hadn't left millions. But he'd left enough to completely change my future. Enough to eliminate student loans. Enough to pay for housing. Enough to let me focus on school instead of working every evening. Instead, I'd stocked grocery shelves until midnight. Studied until dawn. Repeated the cycle for years. Margaret folded her hands. I need to ask you something. Okay. Has your father made any unusually expensive purchases since your grandfather died? I thought about it. At first, nothing. Then memories began connecting. Ryan's brand new pickup truck. The boat Dad always claimed he'd saved up for. The kitchen renovation. The vacation they'd insisted was paid for with careful budgeting. At the time, I'd believed them. Now, every memory looked different. I don't know where the money came from. I'm not saying it did. Margaret's voice remained careful. I'm saying those expenditures deserve examination. Facts, not accusations. That was how lawyers thought. Stick to evidence. Let evidence speak. 3 days later, another call came. This time it wasn't Margaret. It was Nathaniel Brooks. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. I wanted to congratulate you. For your admission. I smiled. Thank you. There was a brief silence. Then he said something unexpected. I've been informed Ms. Ellis located the archived probate records. She did. I'm glad. I hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you saw my last name, what exactly did you remember? He was quiet for several seconds. Finally, he answered. I remembered a grandfather. A man who wouldn't stop talking about his granddaughter. He believed she'd become a lawyer. I closed my eyes. He said that. Repeatedly. Nathaniel chuckled softly. He used to joke that one day you'd probably argue with judges better than I ever could. Tears filled my eyes again. Then why? I couldn't finish. Nathaniel understood anyway. Sometimes, he said gently, the people who plan our future aren't the ones who control what happens after they're gone. The following week, Margaret called with the words that changed everything. I've completed the financial reconstruction. I held my breath. And there are enough documented discrepancies. She paused. To support formal legal action. I sat down slowly. Against my own parents. The thought alone made my chest tighten. Margaret didn't pressure me. She simply placed a folder in front of me. Inside were copies of every certified notice, every trustee obligation, every financial statement, every unanswered request. Years of paperwork, years of silence, years of choices. She looked at me calmly. This isn't about revenge, Favour. She slid one final document across the table. It's about restoring what your grandfather intended. I looked down at the heading. Complaint for breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent concealment, and recovery of trust assets. At the bottom, there was only one line left blank. The plaintiff's signature. My signature.